certainly am hoping that through the discussion and some of the work we can, or some of our discussion, I can learn a little bit from you as well. So this is just kind of a brief snapshot of what I hope to cover this afternoon, giving a little bit of an introduction to just kind of the basics of carbon sequestration and storage in forests. Have a little bit of skimming the surface, talking about climate change impacts on forest carbon. And then some considerations for thinking about planning for adaptation in forest management, which then will hopefully get you thinking a little bit about some of those management options that you can kind of take some of this information and apply it to the work that you're doing. And then end really on kind of where the overlap is between climate adaptation and forest management for mitigation. Throughout this, if there are questions or comments that folks have, it's always difficult when you're presenting and you've got a million screens open to monitor the chat box. Put stuff in the chat box, but Josh or whoever, if you've got a question, don't hesitate to just like raise your hand in Zoom or blurt out your question. We can keep this kind of loose and free in terms of answering questions. But I'm also hoping to have some spots where we kind of take a break from the slides and the presentation and have a little bit of discussion. And then finally, hopefully ending with a discussion about what all this means for your region and the work that you all are doing. All right, so to kind of get into the introduction here, there's been a lot of discussion and interest in forests for their ability to mitigate climate change. Depending upon the year's data that you look at, forests in the US offset anywhere from 11 to 15% of our total CO2 emissions from burning fossil fuels. Forests have upwards of 2/3 of the terrestrial carbon stocks in the country, and are an impressive 90% of our land sector's capacity to sequester additional carbon. Looking at some of those graphics on the right-hand side of the screen, you all know this. Pacific Northwest forests are among the highest, if not the highest, in terms of their ability to sequester carbon in terms of forest productivity, and represent huge stocks of carbon on the land. And so, the forests in your region are really up there in terms of the most important forests for the carbon mitigation capacity. So I'm going to be using some terms here, mitigation, sequestration, storage. You probably all have a pretty good grasp on this terminology, but just to cover our bases, when I'm talking about carbon mitigation, I'm really talking about both carbon sequestration and carbon storage. And there's a difference between the two in terms of carbon dynamics that I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page about. So carbon storage, of course, is the amount of carbon stored in any given pool of carbon, or the carbon stocks in the forest. So that could be above ground biomass, the litter on the forest floor, the below ground roots, carbon stored in the mineral soil. These are all stocks or pools of carbon. Sequestration, on the other hand, is technically, sometimes people talk about sequestration in a kind of a general sense, but the technical definition of sequestration is a flux. It's the process of trees pulling CO2 from the atmosphere and capturing it into biomass. And so that is, as I said, it's a flux, it's a process that is very much a differentiation from a pool or storage. And what these two ideas, sequestration and storage, mean in terms of forests and what different forests and their ability to do this is, kind of varies depending upon where you are. This figure that I'm showing here on the left, this forest succession and developmental time clock, I will admit is developed from a publication that really focuses on eastern forest types. So I think there may be some subtlety there that may not apply to Pacific Northwest forests. But I think that the gist of it still applies, and that's that, you know, when this clock shows, you know, the development from, you know, a regenerating forest at time zero up at midnight. And then over time, you know, the forest is growing, is maturing up to a mature forest at, you know, like 11 o'clock at night or something like that. And so that what this figure is showing is that, of course, that young forests are really good at sequestering carbon. Young trees grow fast. They're really good at pulling carbon from the atmosphere. So that's that dark green color. And then as those forests age and mature, their sequestration rates begin to slow down. They don't typically go to zero. They're still often carbon sinks, but their ability, the strength of that sink diminishes over time. But man, those old forests are really good at storing carbon, and that's shown in the dark brown color. And so when you kind of put that on the sequestration versus storage, you can kind of generally say like young forests are good at sequestration, old forests are good at storage. So kind of with that in mind, you know, we recognize forests are really important for sequestration and storage, but we also recognize that a changing climate presents a lot of risk for the carbon that those forests sequester and store through any number of potential climate change impacts from you know, increasing temperatures, increasing pressures from wildfire, bugs and pests and disease and those sorts of things. And so this is kind of the transition to the next portion of this presentation, where I'm going to just, as I said, kind of skim the surface on some of the highlights of climate change impacts to forest carbon. And as I said before, I'm not an expert on climate change in your region or forest necessarily. So I'm really pulling a lot of this information from this vulnerability assessment that was led by Hudek et al. And Jessica Holofsky, Dave Peterson, and Joanne Ho. I've had the pleasure of working with them through the Adaptation Partners for a number of years now. And you know, you guys are very lucky to have them in your region and the resources that they produce. So a lot of this is not my work. Credit goes to them. So I kind of generally, to make this fun, I try to split this up into, or I have split this up into 3 big topics: shifting seasons, shifting species, and shifting stressors. So that first one, shifting seasons, I like to think about things in groups of 3, apparently. We've got the good, the bad, and the ugly for shifting seasons. So the good is that with climate change, we're experiencing longer growing seasons. So with earlier onset of spring conditions and later cessation of growth in the fall in areas that experience, you know, winter conditions, that means that there's a longer period of time for trees to take up carbon. And indeed, there are pretty reliable data to suggest that forests, when they experience longer growing seasons, are indeed being more productive, and the carbon sink strength of forests is increasing with those longer growing seasons. And that's true as long as you don't have any other limitations on forest productivity. You're likely to experience higher growth rates. These are some figures from the 4th National Climate Assessment to just show, you know, what the Pacific Northwest has already experienced from the early 20th century to that period from 1986 to 2016 is about 2.5 weeks longer growing season on average in the region. And looking forward, the projections for, this is for a high emission scenario for mid-century, are an additional somewhere between 4 to 6 weeks of growing season on top of that. So that's a lot more time for trees to be growing. And so, that could be a good thing from a carbon perspective, right? So at least start off with emphasizing some of the positives here. It goes downhill from here though. um, but some of the modeling work from that vulnerability assessment is showing that, yeah, for some of these forest types are projected to do better in a warmer climate with longer growing seasons. And in particular, Doug fir is projected to expand in the spatial extent of that forest type, um, and, and to a much lesser degree, grand fir as well. But you can see there on this figure also that probably at the expense of some other forest types as well, which leads me into the bad. And the bad part of those longer growing seasons is that there's going to be increased damage, increased pressure from insect pests and disease, of course, which is a big deal. And these are some of the highlights from the vulnerability assessment. And this is true not just of the Pacific Northwest, but everywhere. Warming winters increase the survival rates, where those cold temperatures represent sort of a lethal threshold for a lot of bugs. With warming winters, they're going to be expanding into new areas where they couldn't have been present in the past. In addition, those extending growing seasons mean longer periods of time that's favorable for them for growth and development. That's true of bark beetles. For us here in the Lake States, we're already seeing this play out with the eastern larch beetle, which historically could only have one generation of progeny during the growing season. Now with our extended growing seasons, eastern larch beetle can have 2 generations of progeny in the summertime. So that's an exponential growth in terms of that bug and what it can do. And it's really impacting in Minnesota, larch stands in Minnesota and in Ontario. So, that means the movement of pests into new areas where they hadn't been before. And, there's some projections for balsam woolly adelgid increasing in some of the drier end of the vegetation zones where they're impacting. It's not all about bugs and insect pests and disease. Also, for us in the East, invasive species are a huge deal. And the extended growing seasons mean a lot more pressure from invasives. And that's, I think, also true in your region as well. This comes from that vulnerability assessment that in particular, invasives can be out competing natives in some of these open habitats created by some of those disturbances. For us, the invasive, we have a lot of pressure from understory invasive shrubs in the Lake States in the Northeast. Things like buckthorn, honeysuckle. There's like a laundry list of these things, but they have a lot of phenotypic plasticity, so they can adjust when they leaf out. And our native trees, the overstory, they don't have that plasticity. They're more triggered by day length. And so it's typical now on a spring day to go out there in early spring, and none of the overstory trees have leafed out, but you have a fully leafed out understory of invasives that are just growing like gangbusters because there's no shading from the overstory. This last point here, drought stress from an extended growing season increases the susceptibility of trees, of course, and that's something that we well understand. And that leads me to the last point here, the ugly. When you've got longer growing seasons, that means you have a contracted winter. And shorter winters mean altered hydrologic conditions. And that's probably one of the biggest concerns. So, declining snowpack, longer period for evapotranspiration during those longer growing seasons means greater evapotranspiration, greater moisture deficits, a greater frequency of soil moisture stress. All this adds up to concerns over pushing vegetation past a threshold of mortality. So, this threshold of mortality doesn't even need to include the impacts from those insect pests. Of course, stressed trees are more susceptible to damage from insect pests, but you get to this threshold and we don't even need those bugs to kill off large swaths of trees if you have those warmer and drier conditions. So it's not just mortality rate. It's, of course, though, it's in tree health. It's also productivity. It's also regeneration. Uh, young trees that aren't fully established are oftentimes especially susceptible to those soil moisture deficit conditions. And what this all is leading up to, of course, is the big concern is wildfire. Less moisture means more fires. You have greater fuel aridity. You've got more mortality occurring, so you have more fuels. I'm certainly not a fire expert, and I imagine most of you know a lot more about fire than I do. But to just say that what this all leads to is big concerns from a carbon perspective of catastrophic losses of carbon across the landscape from wildfire. Okay, I can go through these last two sections a little bit quicker. Shifting species, there's been a lot of modeling looking at kind of what all these changes in climate in terms of changing temperatures and precipitation regimes mean for habitat suitability for either for individual species or for whole groups of species or vegetation zones. This figure comes from that vulnerability assessment. And I don't know if the colors are coming through. They're not coming through very well on my screen. But what this essentially is showing is, that those higher elevation systems are the most at risk. They're the most vulnerable as things kind of move higher up in elevation. In other places, it's more about northward shifts in vegetation, when you don't have those high elevation gradients. So it's a little bit of both. But I think for your region, it's probably more about kind of things going in the higher elevation. So you can imagine, depending upon what thing is replacing another thing in terms of vegetation zones, it could be a positive thing ultimately to have kind of a system that has lower carbon stocks being replaced by a vegetation type that can ultimately have higher carbon stocks. But you have to think about sort of the pace of change. And, the concern really is that those changes in climate are really outpacing the ability of these trees to move higher up in elevation in terms of establishment. That's a process that takes many decades to occur. And the pace of change is much faster than that of the climate. And so, that kind of creates a lag in terms of, higher mortality when the current vegetation kind of passes that threshold. But the vegetation kind of lower that could be moving up isn't able to move that fast. So from a carbon perspective, that means it's kind of ultimately a carbon deficit. And then the last one is really about shifting stressors, but it's about kind of the interaction of these stressors more than anything. Climate change is often talked about as a threat multiplier. That's the way the military talks about it. I think it's true. Climate change is kind of turning up the dial on the intensity of a lot of these stressors that, as managers, we're thinking about, have been for many decades. Insect pests and diseases aren't new, invasive species aren't new, but climate change is really ratcheting up the intensity of those pressures. And then, what this figure is showing from a perspective of a single tree is it's really about the interactions of those stressors. So this is kind of showing a healthy, mature tree that in, successive impacts from different stressors happening goes from mature to stressed to injured to passing that threshold of mortality to being a dead tree. And I think Bill Anderegg in their paper that came out in Science this past summer really summarizes it quite nicely in that, forests have always experienced these things and recovered. Why is this different? It's that interaction. It's It's not that there's kind of a constant risk from these things, but it's really the risk is increasing over time, and these impacts are really starting to stack up. And from kind of a landscape perspective of forests, you know, those impacts start to outstrip the ability of the forests to recover in time before the next one hits. And so the concern is that, you know, you start potentially losing forest cover with that increasing risk. Okay, so that was kind of a whirlwind summary of climate change impacts on carbon from my perspective. I'm going to try something here try to get some feedback from you and some discussion going. So if you have another screen or you have a phone in front of you, I want to do a little bit of polling. If you can go to menti.com and you put in this code that you're seeing on the screen, 172058-9, that'll pull up a question. And I'm going to switch my screens here, pull up a different screen, and we can look at kind of what in real time, what folks are thinking about what climate change impacts do you anticipate having the most influence on forest carbon for your region or the place where you work. So I'm going to pull that up. Are you all able to see that screen now? Okay, good. All right, we got one answer, it looks like. We'll give it a few minutes here to let you guys think about this, consider this question. I have put in, kind of preloaded these 4 answers just based off of the vulnerability assessment, my read of it. But I'm really interested in that other category. If there are other things that, you know, kind of keep you up at night thinking about climate change and what it means for your forests, I'd really love to hear those. And maybe we can have a little bit of a discussion about sort of what the rankings for this are, and then maybe what some of those other ideas are. So we're still seeing longer fire season in first there, which was kind of my thought too. But we got 10 answers rolling in. How many people do we have? Okay.
21 people total.
21 people. Okay. Well, we don't have to, not, you know, some people might be limited in their ability to do this. But if you show, it looked like at least somebody has selected other. If you're able to unmute yourself, if that was you, I would love to hear what some additional considerations are.
Yeah, this is Tom. Do you hear me?
Yep, go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, that wasn't my response. The question I have in my mind is, historically, dating back to primarily the 50s, there was the Forest Service and state DNR and other commercial timber companies vastly overstocked their planting after regeneration cuts. And I was just wondering, it has affected the health of the forest with the overcrowding, because there was very little thinning done after establishment, and how that is going to impact carbon sequestration in the later years when those stands get up into the 30, 40-year range.
Yeah, that's a real big concern. I think, you know, just broadly speaking, I've seen some studies that have looked at, you know, the impacts of overstocking on, you know, drought susceptibility. You know, I think there's pretty clear understanding of that, you know, when you have overstock stands, that they're more susceptible to drought. And then of course you have this concern that you can get widespread mortality when you have competition for limiting water. And so one of the excuse me, one of the responses then with that concern is of course thinning is really, an effective tool for reducing that risk. And so if you go in and do some thinning to reduce the competition for water, of course you're taking out carbon, so you're lowering the carbon stock by doing that thinning. But it's really for a long-term gain in the residence time of the remaining carbon. It does you no good to have overstock conditions and then have widespread mortality, drought mortality. In terms of from a carbon perspective, because that system then becomes a carbon source instead of a carbon sink. Whereas, thinning can reduce that mortality, and you can have the remaining trees, continue to be sequestering carbon. So, that is one of those. We'll get into adaptation next in the next section here, but that is one of those adaptation responses to drought. Anybody else want to, chime in? It doesn't have to be if you had some other thoughts. It could be on any of these things, but I'd like to hear from somebody else, what their thoughts about, what kind of keeps you up at night, climate change wise.
Any other folks have any input there? Any questions?
Hi, am I coming through? This is Tom Lamb.
Yeah,
Yep,
we can hear you, Tom.
Hi, just a question, actually two. One, when you talk about the thinning, are there any estimates in terms of the period of time that the products that thinning produce, they will continue to store carbon for some finite period of time? So, if you took the materials from thinning, turned it into building materials, do we have any estimate in terms of how long they would continue to hold the carbon before they are back in the decline and contributing to the to carbon?
Yeah, good question. And I'm not a timber product specialist at all, but certainly in some of the modeling work that I'm involved in, we look at modeling the carbon storage benefits that come from timber products, and there are some just some general considerations that go into that estimation. And, there's some lookup tables that the Forest Service produces on different timber products and the lifetimes of them in terms of, what you get in terms for carbon storage. And, to get to your question, I mean, the answer kind of depends upon at what stage are you thinning. And, for us in the East, we kind of think about pre-commercial thinning versus commercial thinning. And for pre-commercial thinning, it's pulpwood is you're kind of limited in terms of what the timber markets are for that material. And pulpwood is kind of the go-to for that. And that has a pretty short lifespan in terms of the carbon storage value, just a couple of years before, it's in a landfill and pretty much going back to the atmosphere. But if you're taking out, with a commercial thinning, if you've got higher diameter material that you're pulling out there, then, that opens up other markets. And, if you can be thinking about, building materials, those, can have lifespans of 50 to 100 years. When you start getting into some emerging markets like cross-laminated timber, those lifespans are projected to be even longer. So, yeah, there can definitely be value in timber products. I think a caveat, and I should have said this at the outset of my presentation. I'm a forest ecologist, and so most of my thinking and most of my expertise is around carbon in the forests. And I, probably have just enough information and knowledge on timber products to be dangerous. I can answer some questions, but I typically think about carbon in the forest more than anything else.
Okay, I appreciate your answer. In numerous presentations that I've been privy to listen in on, I haven't really heard anybody address that. In fact, in a couple of the ones that we've had, you know, the thought of that was pretty much dismissed by the presenters.
Yeah. I'll get a little bit into some of the work that we're doing. You know, I referenced some carbon modeling work. I'll talk a little bit about that later on. And you'll see when that comes up that wood products is in there. It has to be considered. We have to have a holistic viewpoint in terms of thinking about forestry and carbon. And just because the carbon leaves the forest doesn't mean that it's back in the atmosphere. And we absolutely can't make that assumption. And so, yeah. We need to be including that, you know, timber products in when we think about carbon. I'll just want to get back to the next section of our presentation here, but just give one more opportunity here for if anybody wants to comment on what they voted here on this and why. All right. Well, thank you for your input here. I'm going to go back to the slides and we'll get back into it. All right. So I've given this carbon impact or climate impacts on carbon, forest carbon presentation a few times. And the last time I did it was to a group of DNR managers and consulting foresters. And all I had time to cover was climate impacts on carbon. And when I opened it up for questions afterwards, I just kind of had a bunch of people, you know, on my screen on Zoom just staring at me. And finally somebody unmuted and said, man, that's dark. And so I'm really glad that I don't have to stop there. I can talk about the next section here, which is what do we do about it? Which is I think the fun part and the uplifting part of the presentation is that it's not all doom and gloom, that there's stuff that we can do here. And so the first thing that we can really start thinking about is, well, how do we adapt to these changes? So just to throw a definition out there, adaptation is the adjustment of systems in preparation or in response to climate change. And adaptation actions that we can take in forest management really are designed to intentionally address climate change impacts and vulnerabilities. What are the risks that our forests face from climate change in order to help us meet the goals and objectives that we have for our forests? And I bolded that word intentionally because adaptation really should be and best happens when we have intentionality about these considerations. We think about what is the risk that our forests face? How can we respond? How can we address that risk? That's the intentionality part. When we think about forests and ecosystem-based adaptation, you know, it's really building upon the things that we already know about sustainable management, conservation of our resources, restoration of our forests. Climate adaptation is not throwing away our old tools and recreating the toolbox. It's really building off of our existing toolbox. So much of what climate adaptation is just good forest management. And it's that intentionality piece. It's about taking the good forest management tools that we have and using them to address the climate change risks. So this is section is a little shameless self-promotion. I'm going to give you a little bit of a summary about the work that NIAX does. We do, almost all of our work is around working with forest managers, natural resource professionals around helping them to understand climate change risks and how to adapt to those risks. And we've created a number of resources for folks to help them through that process. And so this GTR you're seeing here on your screen, Forest Adaptation Resources, is sort of our guidebook for adaptation and forest management. There are others out there. This is not the only one. And as I've mentioned before, you are very lucky to have adaptation partners in your region, and they have a whole host of excellent resources for you. And we've worked a lot with them to kind of merge what we've done in eastern forest types with what they've done in the Pacific Northwest. And I can provide some information later on about that. But we have the adaptation workbook. It's designed for eastern forest types, and it's designed for a whole diverse variety of landowners with a diverse variety of goals and objectives for their forest lands. Because we don't have to live with the decisions you make. You have to live with the decisions you make. We don't make recommendations. Our process is designed to put the users in the driver's seat, and we just provide you with resources and tools to inform your decision-making process. So the adaptation resources consists of kind of two main pieces. First is the adaptation workbook, which I'll describe here in a second, and then the adaptation strategies and approaches menus, which I'll then describe next. So the adaptation workbook is, it is a workbook that GTR has worksheets in it. And when we do in-person workshops with folks on adaptation planning, they fill out worksheets. They fill out pieces of paper. So we're old school. And the workbook is really just an adaptive management process that we've centered around climate change. And you can see the 5 steps here really start with defining where you're working and what are you trying to achieve? What are your goals and objectives in that first step? The second step is about taking all of the climate change impacts that are happening regionally and saying, what is it about my project? What is it about my forest, my site that makes it particularly vulnerable to climate change? So it's really about like, what are the site conditions that are really present the most climate change risk? The third step, oh, and I should say that, so that uses those vulnerability assessments. We've produced a number of vulnerability assessments for our region, but fortunately for you, you have this vulnerability assessment for your region. So the adaptation workbook will work for you. The third step is just about evaluating your goals and objectives and making sure that you can still meet your goals and objectives given all the challenges that climate change might present. And sometimes, and it rarely happens, but people have to go back to step 1 and say like, okay, maybe I need to rethink my goals and objectives because they're just not feasible given climate change. That fourth step is about identifying what the adaptation actions are that you're going to take. And this uses these menus of strategies and approaches that I'll talk about in a second. And then because this is adaptive management, we need to be thinking about how are we going to monitor to determine whether or not what we're doing is working, and if it's not, how do we adjust in our next round of planning to do something different to help us meet our goals and objectives. Okay, so those menus of strategies and approaches. We've got a number of these. We started out with one based on forestry, and we've added to these. But they're basically like a menu at a restaurant. They list kind of a bunch of possible actions that you could take, and you pick and choose what's relevant for your location, your set of conditions, your goals and objectives. And so like a menu on a restaurant, there are things that don't go together. You know, I wouldn't go to a restaurant and order spaghetti and meatballs and a milkshake because it just doesn't work for me. And like that, these menus have contrasting ideas that you probably would not implement together. And that's okay because it's really a tool to help you brainstorm what is going to work for you. A little bit more about these menus. They're really meant to be stepping stones, brainstorming tools, so to speak. They really kind of build off of big ideas and help you kind of hone down to a specific set of actions. So they're really designed to be kind of hierarchical in nature. They really start off by kind of forcing you to think about the foundational concepts of adaptation. Are you trying to resist impacts of climate change? Are you trying to build resilience in your system to absorb those impacts and be able to rebound? Or are you trying to transition your system to something that looks different than it is now, but is more adapted to the future, right? So these ideas of resistance, resilience, and transition really are kind of foundational concepts in adaptation. And so our menu kind of starts there and then offers a number of strategies, which are kind of broad ideas that are applicable across a range of geographies or a range of goals that you might have. And then underneath each strategy, you'll have multiple approaches, approach being a more specific description of that particular strategy. More descriptive, more applicable to a particular location or a goal that you might have. And then we ask users then to ultimately select the tactic or the specific prescriptive action that they're going to take. And the menu provides some ideas on that, but there's like an infinite number of ways that you could implement any given approach. And so it's really up to the user to identify, like, this is how I'm going to do it. This is how I'm going to implement this particular approach. And the whole idea here being that using the workbook and the menu together help you connect the dots between what you're trying to achieve with your goals and what you're going to do on the ground, your prescriptive action, and, you know, kind of what are the impacts from climate change that you're worried about. And, you know, it basically puts it all together really nicely for you. Helps you communicate what you're doing as well in a really nice way and in kind of a logical fashion. So we started out with a menu for forestry. When I started with NIAX over 5 years ago, I was just working with people on climate change adaptation and forest management. And as time went by, I kept working with folks who were saying, like, all right, well, you know, you've got these adaptation resources, but they don't really address goals related to carbon. And we've got all the scientific literature on forest carbon management, but it doesn't really recognize climate change in it. What do I do? And, you know, they really highlighted to us that we needed to create a menu specifically to address climate adaptation and goals related to carbon. And so Josh sent around that paper that came out in Journal of Forestry about a year ago that really kind of describes the process and kind of those underlying ideas that, you know, I'm essentially summarizing here, which is that really to be managing long-term for resilient carbon sequestration and storage, we need to be finding that overlap between adaptation and mitigation. We need to really be finding that integration and that sweet spot where they are complementary with one another. And by doing that, we can be managing for resilient carbon sinks into the future. And so we created what we call the practitioner's menu of strategies and approaches for forest carbon management. Long-winded title, I just refer to it typically as the carbon menu. And, you know, this graphic kind of shows a really brief description of the seven strategies that are in the menu. And underneath each of these 7 strategies, there's a number of approaches, so 31 different approaches that really kind of build off of that idea of integration. So, you know, if a particular strategy or approach is about resisting stressors, well, then you get mitigation benefits by that because you're protecting carbon stocks. If you're building resilience, well, then you're both protecting carbon stocks, but you're also hopefully enhancing the sequestration capacity. If you're guiding transition of your system to something that looks a bit different than what it is now, you know, you're maybe enhancing current sequestration, but you're also, you know, building the capacity to sequester carbon into the future. So that's kind of that idea of synergy between the two ideas. Well, following the development of that tool, you know, we've gotten a lot of interest in folks who really want to be utilizing it to be thinking about, well, how do we manage our forest for for adaptation and for mitigation. And so we've formed a collaborative team. We were very lucky to get funding from the US Climate Alliance to kind of use this carbon menu, kind of put it to the test for modeling forest management scenarios that we're developing working with state agencies here in the Lake States. So this logo soup slide here is really, I'll interpret it for you. We're working with Minnesota, Michigan, and Wisconsin DNR, and our team consists of myself from NIAX and my collaborators from American Forests and the Michigan State University's Forest Carbon and Climate Program. And we've formed this team working with our partners, with the Forest Service. Of course, NIAX, we're about half of our staff is Forest Service. But importantly, we're working with Werner Kurtz and his staff at Natural Resources Canada, who've developed the carbon budget model for the Canadian Forest Service. So this is the model that we're using. And that'll be important here in a second as I kind of describe some of this work. But I just want to say, you know, this project that we're doing in the Lake States, you know, quickly got a lot of attention from folks. And we've quickly been expanding our work now. We are finalizing a contract with Oregon Department of Forestry to do the same work in Oregon. And we are also now finalizing a contract with CAL FIRE to do this in California forests. And of course, as many of you probably know, there's a lot of regional collaboration in the Pacific Northwest to be thinking about forest carbon and forest management. And so, you know, we hope that we will have an opportunity to expand into Washington as well with this work. So part of this work really starts with engaging with stakeholders like yourself and thinking about what are the forest management scenarios that provide opportunities for carbon mitigation into the future. And the way, and I'm leading the stakeholder engagement work as part of this modeling team. And the way I'm approaching this work is to really kind of put things into bins. Again, three things here. I just seem to have a penchant for grouping things into threes. But the three categories that we're using to really start thinking about what are the management scenarios are, you know, thinking about forest carbon losses, thinking about ways that we can increase forest carbon, and then recognizing forest carbon opportunities and harvested wood products. All these things contribute to sequestration and storage. And so in that first point about thinking about forest carbon losses, you know, this is obviously a big deal everywhere, but no more so than in the Pacific or in the West in general, where fire is such a big deal for carbon. And so, you know, this forest carbon management menu is really one of those tools to help folks thinking about, you know, what is the vulnerability of my forest to fire or to any of these other, you know, stressors that represent the potential to lose carbon from my forest. And, you know, oftentimes when we think about mitigation, you know, we just kind of focus on the sequestration part, but you know, not losing the carbon that we have is as important, if not more important, to be thinking about climate mitigation and carbon mitigation. And so we can't be sequestering additional forest or additional carbon if we're just losing even more carbon somewhere else on the landscape. So, you know, so one of the benefits of a tool like the forest carbon management menu is helping people, you know, assess what are the vulnerabilities to these things like wildfire, the risk of decreasing tree habitat suitability that represents, you know, a loss of carbon into the future, or, you know, your risk from non-native insect pests. And just a quick case study for somebody who I worked with using the menu to kind of think about some of this risk from a carbon perspective. I worked with a group from Community Forests International, which is a group based in Canada, and they have almost 700 acre property in New Brunswick, which is part of a forest offsets program project that's been almost 10 years in an offsets project. And this property has a 20 acre hemlock stand with really large mature hemlocks. And, you know, they're really concerned about hemlock woolly adelgid and what this means for their carbon project in the stand. And so I worked with a couple of the managers from CFI to go through the adaptation workbook, to use the carbon menu. And some of the management goals were really focused squarely on carbon, on, you know, increasing the resistance of some of those mature hemlock to the hemlock woolly adelgid, but then also thinking about, well, how do we increase the species diversity in the stand? Because we know hemlock woolly adelgid's going to come, it's going to hit us probably in the next 10 years. And that's really the big, you know, climate impact concerns were about warming winters and increased growing season length as it relates to, you know, the insect coming and impacting their forest. So we went through the workbook. They identified, you know, strategies and approaches and the specific tactics to implement those. And what I want to highlight here is that one of the tactics that they came up with is harvesting 30% of their overstory of the hemlock to increase the health of those remaining trees, the remaining 70% of the basal area of their stand, to resist the impacts of hemlock woolly adelgid. So this is really a departure from what somebody would normally do in a carbon offset project. You typically would not be harvesting 30% of the basal area of your trees, but they were doing it because they recognize that it's a little bit of a hit now in order to increase the carbon residence time of the remaining trees, and then doing some planting in those openings that they've created to start to restart the sequestration process, which is not normally what you would do typically, I think, in an offset project scenario. And this just kind of highlights that, you know, this idea that if you have a really vulnerable system, the best thing from a carbon perspective might not be, you know, you hear a lot about like extended rotations for carbon. Well, that's great if you have a low vulnerability in your system. But if you have a highly vulnerable system, you probably, from a carbon resident standpoint, you probably want to be thinking in the opposite direction. You want to be thinking about decreasing your stocking, shortening your rotations. That's going to probably provide you greater carbon benefits. It's just a little counterintuitive, I think. I'm going to take a moment to kind of pause from the carbon management menu discussion to just bring in some work that I've been involved with my colleague, Luke Nave at NIAX. Luke does a lot of meta-analysis on forest management impacts on soil carbon. And he's, as part of this forest soil carbon initiative, which is funded through our partners at American Forests, he's been doing some of these regional assessments of soil carbon vulnerability. And he's got a paper that's now in review looking at the role of fire in the Pacific Northwest in terms of impacts on soil carbon stocks. And so this is just a teaser. This paper is in review right now, so I can't give you any more information, but I did get permission from Luke to share some of these results, which is, you know, kind of looking at the question of the difference between wildfire and prescribed fire on carbon losses from soils, right? So we know fire impacts above ground carbon significantly. And there's a big difference between prescribed fire and wildfire in terms of their intensity and those impacts on above ground carbon. What about below ground carbon? What his data from the meta-analysis show is that, and you can see here in this panel A, when you look across the entire soil profile, there's decreases in soil carbon in both prescribed fire and wildfire. And that's true looking below in low severity and high severity fire. Those are just basically, you know, the same thing. But when you look at that panel on the right, and you look at how it impacted the parts of the soil profile, you see that on the forest floor, prescribed fire, which is those open circles, you know, has a decrease like in wildfire. But when you look at the topsoil and the subsoil, those open circles, that the confidence interval overlaps 0, meaning that for prescribed fire, there isn't any significant change in carbon in both the topsoil and subsoils, but for wildfire there is. And so these are really interesting data that are suggesting that wildfire, you know, is impacting soil carbon in the region, whereas prescribed fire isn't. And this gets at a question I get asked a lot when I present to folks. And they say, you know, prescribed fire is a great tool, but if I'm want to be managing for carbon, should I be not using fire? And, you know, I typically say, no, I mean, it's one of the tools in our toolbox. Definitely use fire because, you know, if it's helping the health of your system. And this is, you know, pointing to some, I think, some important results to suggest that, yeah, prescribed fire, you know, has some really short-term impacts on carbon from a below ground perspective. It's not going to impact your carbon levels at all. And in fact, it can be doing a lot more good than harm. Okay, getting back to this perspective of, you know, using the carbon menu and thinking about how we kind of think about forest management scenarios, you know, from a practical standpoint for planning forest management, from a modeling standpoint for how do we model these things to understand the impacts. The second category of looking for opportunities to increase forest carbon, I think is sort of the place where we have a lot more comfort, or I think it's a lot more intuitive to say, like, yeah, we want to be thinking about ways that we can increase things, increase carbon in our forests. Before I move on to this blue box in the middle, though, I want to just address this forest carbon losses piece, because this is a difficult one to model. Models aren't very good at integrating climate change into them. Carbon models, I should say, aren't very good at that, and most models don't have any ability to do that. And so it's difficult to say, you know, from like going back to that thinning question, you know, a carbon model just off the shelf, you say, okay, well, I'm going to do a thinning because I have overstock conditions and I'm worried about drought mortality. Most carbon models off the shelf are just going to tell you, well, if you thin, you're going to decrease the amount of carbon in your stand, and so it's not good for carbon. That's because models aren't able to incorporate, you know, the risk of mortality and the carbon loss that comes along with that risk. And so it's going to be a net negative in terms of carbon stocks because it can't quantify impacts that might happen into the future. And so what we're doing with our modeling effort, and this is why working with the Canadian team led by Werner Kurtz with this model is so important, is that we're figuring out ways to take their model and integrate climate change so that we can represent that there are benefits to doing these adaptation measures. There are benefits to thinning, and here's where they show up. It's because with changing climate, the risk for losing carbon is this much, and if we do some thinning, then that shrinks down to this much, right? So we're figuring out ways to quantify these things. Okay, so for the second piece on looking for ways to increase opportunities to increase forest carbon, The menu has been very helpful for us, I think, because it's really, it's really that way to help people brainstorm. And it's a way to help people think about, we're used to thinking about above ground carbon. We're used to thinking about timber volume or, carbon stored in trees. But we don't oftentimes think about some of those other carbon pools that are very important as well. Deadwood pools, soil mineral carbon pools. And so the menu is a way to really help people to start thinking kind of outside of their comfort zone, outside of where they're normally thinking about in terms of management and carbon. It's also a way to think about, well, what are we trying to regenerate, and what's the prospects for that regeneration into the future? And might we be thinking about ways to regenerate a different set of species? Maybe there are some other species that are going to do better into the future. And if we do things a little bit differently, we can be, regenerating these future adapted species. Or maybe we need to be doing some different planting. In the East, we typically don't plant things. We let the forest regenerate naturally, which is a little bit of a departure, I think, from how management happens in your region. But people are now talking about planting because the regeneration, what you expect to come back after a harvest, may not be, species that are expected to do well into the future, and we need to be kind of increasing species diversity. And then, the last point, and I think it's a big one, probably, especially, for the diversity of folks in this group, is folks don't own forests because they want to manage them for carbon exclusively. Typically, there's a whole bunch of other reasons why, private landowners own forests and why agencies are managing forests. It's wildlife habitat, it's recreation, water supply, there's all these other things. And, we need to be thinking holistically about these things, and how does carbon management fit in with these other goals that we have for our forests. And so on that point, I'm just going to, I think, end with another quick case study, again, from the East, because that's where we work. We had an opportunity to work with a group from Audubon, Vermont on a forest management plan revision for the Green Mountain Audubon Center, which is located in central Vermont. Not surprisingly, because this is Audubon, this property is really managed for birds. It's a demonstration area for their Foresters for the Birds program. It's a designated important bird area. And it's also an area used for research and education, as well as recreation. And kind of typical for the region, it's sort of an even age stand that came back after agricultural abandonment. So it's kind of all 100-year-old trees, but it's kind of got different strata. They've got some pretty big overstory hemlocks, and then some shorter but diverse hardwoods underneath that. It's a pretty resilient site. They're not too worried about climate change impacts, other than just sort of the same things that everybody else are worried about, invasive plants, insect pests, decreased snowpack in the winter, these things. But it's a pretty resilient site. So this was an opportunity to ask that question of, like, can we be kind of reaching our mission goals of bird habitat while also be managing for adaptation and mitigation? I just want to highlight here on this table, what some of the tactics that they came up for are listed on that leftmost column, and then sort of the benefits for bird habitat adaptation and mitigation. But what I really want to point out is that when they used the menu, they kind of had a light that came on, that they were like, hey, we typically wouldn't be managing for red oak. It's in our forest, but it's a small proportion of our forest, and we don't typically think about it. It's Vermont, so they typically think about like sugar maple. Mostly, I think it's a law that you have to tap every sugar maple tree in Vermont. But anyway, oak's not something they normally think about. And they had this kind of light bulb that came on that, oaks are actually projected to do well into the future. So there's some adaptation and mitigation benefits there, but oaks also support a really diverse insect population. And insects are a food source for a lot of the interior forest birds that we're thinking about. And so, using the menu kind of helped them to kind of think broadly, think outside the box, kind of brainstorm some of these ideas and come up with some tactics that they hadn't originally thought of, which is, to promote or even plant red oaks in some of their harvested areas. So they're going to create some gaps to do some regeneration and diversify their stands. So that's just kind of an example, I think, of where, adaptation and mitigation can also be contributing to some of the other important co-benefits that we look towards our forests for providing. Again, shameless self-promotion or plug for the work that we do. We do these adaptation planning and practices online trainings. Get in contact with me if you'd be interested. We typically focus on our region in the East, but we've been getting a lot of interest from folks outside of Region 9. And so, we've been broadening the geographic scope that we work in. But you can just go to adaptationworkbook.org and you can create an account and you can kind of go through this whole adaptation planning process in kind of the self-guided format. And we see people from all over the country and even all over the world doing that, which is pretty neat. The last shameless self-promotion plug I've got to put in here is that if you're interested in learning more about forest carbon management, NIAX has teamed up with our partners at Michigan State University Forest Carbon and Climate Program to create this Understanding Forest Carbon Management short course. It's a e-learning course. You can do it on your own time. It's currently in its 4th iteration. We launched it about 1.5 years ago. And we've gotten a lot of good feedback from folks on it. And some of that positive feedback led to us getting some additional funding to start developing regional modules for this short course. And so Pacific Northwest is one of the areas that we're developing a regional model for. So this is something I'm currently working on. We expect to launch these in later on in the year. But it's really taking region-specific information on climate impacts, on carbon management strategies and approaches, and not being so broad brush like we are in that course that I just showed in the previous slide. So we are going to hold a workshop in a couple of weeks here to get some feedback from folks in the Pacific Northwest. We've had a survey go out. We'd love to get more input from people. So this is kind of a call. Get in touch with me if you would be willing to help us out. Answer a few survey questions, or even consider joining us for a few hours to kind of go through and provide some feedback and input on the information that we're putting together for this course.
That sounds great, Todd. Just to reach out to folks and let you all know, you can reach out to me and I'll connect you to, or obviously I'm sure Todd will probably present his contact info here at the end. So however we can help you out with that, that sounds like a really cool initiative, and yeah, we'd be happy to help.
Great. Well, I do appreciate that very much. Yeah, so I'll put up my contact information, but I mean, I've talked for far too long now, and I want to get back to the interactive part. Josh promised this is going to be interactive, and so I've got a few more questions for you guys, and this kind of gets into now, like, okay, we've had that look at adaptation and how to think about adaptation in terms of forest carbon management. And so, again, I don't have the regional expertise that you all have. And so I'm really interested in, we can just have a general discussion about it. We don't have to use Menti, but if you still have that open on your phone or up on your web browser, if you can pull that up and and answer a few additional questions. I'd love to know, first of all, I've given a little bit of example, but mostly from eastern forests, and we talked a little bit about thinning. What are some other ideas you guys have about management for that first part about, what are some of those ways that we can address reducing risk of carbon loss from climate change, from wildfire, from these insect pests and disease? What are some of our management options that we've got? So again, if you don't want to type it in to Menti, just unmute yourself, and we can just have a discussion about it. But I'd love to be able to kind of record some of these responses here. Great. So we've got assisted migration. I did hint at it, moving species around to other zones. Yes, that is an option. And I've got some thoughts on that. I will quickly provide some thoughts here, and we can address some of these other answers as they roll in. But in terms of assisted migration is, I think, a controversial topic. There's a lot of people who have a lot of resistance to the idea of moving things around to places where they haven't been in the past because of concerns about invasion. We've had a bad track record, frankly, in the past with moving things around, and so people are cautious with that. There are other more, I think, what do I want to say? There's less, assisted migration is kind of out here. There's other things that are a little less aggressive in terms of what we could be doing. And some of those things are, you could be looking at planting the same species that you're already planting now, but just looking at a broader seed zone. The Forest Service has this amazing tool called the seed lot selection tool. And you could put in your location and say, given what the climate in my location is going to look like in the future, where should I be looking for seeds for this particular species that I'm interested in planting? That's a way to just kind of broaden the genetic diversity. And we've been messing around with genetics for species for a long time, and improved genetics and those sorts of things. And so this is not anything, I think, that is outside of the box for a lot of people. Is just kind of looking more broadly about where your seeds come from. Another option is, and I kind of hinted at it in that Audubon Vermont example, is that there's things that may be at your site, but they're just a minor component of the forest. If you're working in forests that have diverse species composition, you could kind of be looking at what are some species that are expected to do well that I could promote, that I could emphasize in my management. You could also look to kind of those neighboring areas, whether it's a elevational zone or, for some folks, it's looking to the south and saying, okay, what's sort of going to be moving into my region in terms of habitat suitability. So for, in the UP, we're looking at species that are predominant in forests, in Wisconsin or even further south. So like some of those oak or hickory species that really aren't prevalent or even present in some of our Upper Peninsula forests, we can be looking to those for planting. And so that's more of a range expansion than it is an assisted migration. All right, so thanks. I've got a couple more responses in here. Let's look at these. So prescribed fire on federal and non-federal lands, yes. And that's, I think, a really important one. Reducing fuel loads, taking out ladder fuels, those sorts of things. Yep, and we have another comment about that. Fire ladders to older growth, fire prevention for clearing definite undergrowth. Diversity in species, better balance with management, get caught up with thinning. Yeah, those are all really good ideas. And the species diversity one is one that I was wondering if I would hear, if we would see come up in this discussion. Again, not an expert in the forest types in your region. A lot of what we talk about in our eastern forests, which are diverse anyway, is can we enhance that diversity? The more eggs you got in the basket, the more options you have in the future in terms of trees to species to do well.
This is Tom. One of the issues I deal with is a little bit of wildlife, and how to balance the biomass issue and carbon issue with wildlife demands.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This especially involving endangered species.
Yeah. Well, and it's especially with endangered species. I mean, you've got legal requirements to be managing for habitat for a species. So, you got to work within those restrictions that the Endangered Species Act requires for habitat conditions. Outside of kind of legal requirements, there's a lot of talk in my region about, as forests kind of mature from agricultural abandonment, we're losing a lot of early successional habitat. And so those species, those wildlife species that are dependent upon early successional habitat are really in decline. And so there's a big push, excuse me, there's a big push to be creating more early successional habitat for these species. And that comes in into the carbon discussion to say like, hey, well, what does this mean then for carbon? What if we want to be managing for carbon and for early successional species? And there's no two ways about it. There's a trade-off there in terms of carbon stocks. On the flip side of the coin, though, you can be thinking about the importance of wood products that are coming off. If you're doing management to create early successional species, there are if there's wood products coming off of that, there's carbon stored there, and then you're restarting sequestration as then that forest rebounds from harvesting. And so, there's some carbon benefits there. But, there's always going to be a balance, I think. And you can't, I don't think you can necessarily put one thing, you can't put carbon ahead of some of these other things when you've got agency or organizational mandates to be managing for other things that maybe there's a trade-off for. We got some other ideas coming in here. Signage and penalties for heavily hiked trails. Oh, that's an interesting one. I know we want to reserve some time for you guys to have your updates and do some of your other business. And so Josh said that we want to wrap up by about half after the hour. So I'm gonna just move on to our next slide here, because I would love to just get your thoughts on this other question, which is, that last question was about how do we avoid carbon losses. This question is, what are some of the management options that we have to consider for enhancing mitigation opportunities or enhancing carbon storage? So I'll just throw one out there. Extended rotations is something people talk a lot about. It's a way that we can, not be harvesting based on sort of the economic optimum, but be thinking about more of the biological optimum for carbon storage on a site. That one gets thrown out there a lot, but there's a whole, realm of other things that we could be considering. So what are some other ideas you guys have that might be some opportunities for Southwest Washington and carbon storage in your forests? reducing overstocking. Yep. Yep, that is definitely opportunity. Data that I've seen, strongly suggests that when you reduce overstocking, you give the remaining trees room to grow. Annual increment increases quite a bit. You get a lot higher growth rates, and you're maintaining stocking on your stands. Protecting large old trees, yes. One of the things in the menu, and I see people really gravitate to a lot, is that idea of protecting legacy trees. These are things that are, a big proportion of the carbon stored in stands are in the remaining old huge trees that have survived. And we're preserving the genetics, we're preserving the seed source. They're great for wildlife. I think it's a really important place to be thinking about all these other benefits that are important in addition to carbon. Yeah, so protection and reserves, certainly, and again, especially important on places that we think have inherent resilience, have inherent adaptive capacity. These are places that are at low risk for carbon losses. Well, then let's protect them. That makes a lot of sense. Any idea or any thoughts if folks want to just chime in? Unmute yourself and chime in vocally too. Feel free to do that. Some of the other things are, one of my favorite new words is morticulture. So thinking about enhancing deadwood pools, especially when you have low grade material, you've got these, maybe trees that are just have poor growth form. They're not really good for saw logs. They could be girdled and left as snags that enhance wildlife. They could be dropped and left to lay on the forest floor. But in managed forests, deadwood pools are oftentimes lacking. Especially when you're thinking about like an old growth stand. That's where a big difference in old growth and managed stands are oftentimes not only in your big trees but also in your deadwood pools. And so, there's ways that we can enhance deadwood carbon pools in our managed stands just by looking opportunistically at like where is the low value wood, and do we really need to take it out of there, or can we leave it? And we get benefits for carbon, we get benefits for wildlife, those sorts of things. All right, thanks for that input. I am going to just go back to my slides one more time here. Because there's my contact information. You can email me at that email address. Love to hear any additional feedback you have, and certainly reach out if you're interested in the regional short course material and participating in our questionnaire or survey on that. So thank you so much for sticking it out here and for inviting me to join you today. And I don't know, Josh, if you want to just move right into your next thing, but if there are.
I think we've got a few moments for some potential follow-up questions. We don't have a super packed agenda today. So yeah, if anyone has any additional questions or comments, feel free to jump in there. Anybody? I mean, we've had such good interaction thus far. I'm sure folks might have already expended the tanks.
Yeah, gotten your questions out. That's fine. Well, if anything comes up as you are thinking about this when you're going through the rest of your day, feel free to reach out and email me.
We appreciate it.
Yeah, this is Tom again.
Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, one of the questions that I have is how urban development and how that either removes all the biomass or is there recovery involved in that?
Yeah, urban ecosystems are very poor at carbon sequestration and storage. So, you know, I think Nature Conservancy has published a few papers on natural climate solutions and kind of evaluating sort of the opportunities for natural climate solutions and carbon sequestration and storage. And we've used those analyses that they've provided in some of our work with the U.S. Climate Alliance, working with individual states. Washington is part of the Climate Alliance and has participated in this. And your governor obviously is very progressive in thinking about carbon mitigation and climate. Avoiding carbon or avoiding forest loss, in particular forest loss to urban development, typically comes out as the #1 thing that we can do in terms of carbon mitigation. And so any way that we can preserve forests and forest loss, whether it's urban development or agricultural, is going to give us the biggest bang for our buck, hands down, over anything else that we can do. And it is the biggest issue. In existing urban systems, we can be, you know, thinking about where to plant trees and enhancing tree cover in our urban systems and making them better carbon sinks. Yeah, forest loss, whether it's to urban systems or otherwise, is one of the biggest issues. Thanks for that question.
Go ahead there, Tom. If you have a question, Tom Lannon, go for it.
Thank you. First of all, I've got to do a shout out to Gina Owen. Howdy, glad to see you. I think she's the new region forester for the region that you're working in, Todd.
Yep, for the Eastern region. Yep.
I certainly enjoyed working with her when she was here. So that said, this is a kind of a simple question. I keep looking at the forests around here and the density of the crowns, and it's just, I guess, more about water. There's a term called sublimation, which is when, you know, you have a change of state without going from a solid to a liquid. What impact does the density of the crown have on the hydrological side of the equation in terms of getting water to the ground, both for the trees, but also for the underlying water resources?
Wow, man, you didn't throw me a softball there. Well, I'm not a hydrologist, so it's complex, and you know, digging into the answer there, I think, is probably beyond my level of expertise. There's a lot of considerations there, certainly, and you know, I think some of the work, at least in on the Chippewa National Forest, and that's been led by some of the folks working there, Tony D'Amato and Brian Palick, have kind of looked at in red pine stands, kind of finding out sort of where the sweet spot is in terms of evapotranspiration. And you know, you open up the canopy too much, and you get a lot more evapotranspiration happening from sunlight hitting the floor and heating the soil surface. But when you have a really dense canopy, then of course you have a lot more water demand from the plant's use. And so there is, and it's going to be dependent upon just, you know, the physiology of the trees that you're looking at, of the forest types you're looking at. But there is, you know, some good evidence that there's kind of a sweet spot in terms of what level of thinning is going to kind of reduce that competition for water from the roots of the trees, but not opening things up too much so that you're just, you know, losing water from evaporation. And there's been some good work looking at that. I know there's a paper that I can send you that summarizes some of that work. Botero et al. Is the citation, but I'd be happy to share that paper. That was a former student of Tony D'Amato who did that work.
Oh, okay. Boy, for someone who's not a hydrologist, you speak well.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have a question or comment for Todd before we let him go? Okay. Well, we'll let you get off the hook here, Todd. You spent a lot of time with us, and we really appreciate you sharing your knowledge with the collaborative today and offering your expertise. If anyone has any additional questions, and of course, we'd love to help you out with that regional program. So feel free to shoot me an email or I'll connect with you if I don't hear from you, and we can get the wheels turning on that front as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much again for inviting me to join you. This has been a real pleasure, and I hope to hear from you all in the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Have a good day.
Bye-bye. You too.
Bye. Okay, folks. Well, another great speaker and a lot of good information to process. So some really great question and answer there. And I did enjoy the Mentimeter thing. That's the first time I've ever used that, but it did kind of break up the presentation, kind of add a little interactive component to it. So we'll keep experimenting with those things in the future. And thanks for your willingness to give it a try. So we'll just move right on to our standard sort of segments of the monthly meetings, and we'll kick that off by handing the mic over to our district ranger, Aaron Black, for our Forest Service Ranger updates. Go right ahead, Aaron.
Thanks, Josh. Hi, everyone. Our biggest news is that the Upper Wind EA is ready to go out for comment. So I think the interactive part today kind of helped me think about how we might make that interactive for you all especially. But we're looking at early March to put it out for comment, and then really revisit some of those conversations we've had around the early Seral block. So I'm putting together some highlights. EAs are always long. We try to shorten them and make them as friendly to read as possible, but we'll also have a quick summary up front for those that have less time. And then secondly, we're already digging into Little White, our next planning area, working with DNR, trying to identify all the potential stands that we'll want to survey this summer. And so lining out contracts and that sort of thing. I'm still filling some vacancies. I mentioned last month that our silviculturist, John Nakai, retired. So we'll be doing interviews next week for that position. And as soon as that person is on board, I'll bring them to a collaborative. And then my position should be advertised next week. That one has been a long time coming, and got a lot of people that have been waiting for it. So I think we'll have a pretty robust list. So I'll keep you posted on that. On terms of recreation, I've mentioned this before, but I want to just keep bringing it up so that it's not a shocker or surprise this summer. But we are experimenting with the Lower Falls area on a limited ticket entry. So people will get their permit for the day use at Lower Falls online as a way to manage that corridor. We just had so much use and safety concerns with people parked all along the 90 road. So we'll be doing a larger public campaign, but talk to your friends, make sure people, the word is getting out on that. And then on the timber front, we just sold Tyee timber sale, which is part of the Middle Wind. It went above bid. We're really excited. It's a project that this group, we can certainly get out and monitor. It's just on the Wind River Highway, just north of Carson. So it'll be one that'll be easy to get to and discuss maybe this summer, if not certainly next summer. And then King is our only, we don't have any active sales right now with the weather, but King is one of our sales that we're watching the snow closely, and we may have a pre-work in the next couple of weeks, and that one may start up. So that's all I have for today. Any questions?
Any questions for Aaron, folks? Well, if you think of anything, of course, I can connect you. So feel free to reach out at any point. Tom, you have a question?
This is Tom. with the lower falls, you know, it displaced quite a few campers, hikers, day use people. Was there any thought given to where those people are going to migrate to and what impact they'll have on other areas?
Yeah, absolutely. So we saw a little bit of that this summer, that we encourage people to head to Middle Falls, to Upper Falls. And so then those areas got quite a bit of use. We're going to do our best to make sure the word is out about some lesser known sites, just to spread the use out. So that'll be part of our bigger public campaign. And also talk about the 90 road corridor as a larger destination. You know, Lower Falls sort of singularly got all the attention, and that's what people know, and that's where they tend to congregate. And if we can just broaden that to even within the 90 road corridor to some of the other sites along there, I think that will help.
Any other questions or comments?
Yeah,
Go ahead, Tom.
Aaron, just briefly, we've had some conversations with our public works group and your roads engineer about the 90 road there. I'd just like to follow up on that sometime in the near future. Okay.
Sounds good.
End of report.
Sounds good.
I have a question, backtracking a little bit. I just don't remember from scoping. Is any of the upperwind EA impacted by the northern spotted owl new listing situation?
Good question. So what Lucy is referring to is the essentially delisting of critical habitat, the removal of critical habitat on National Forest System lands within the matrix. So we're sort of still figuring out how that will impact us. Most notably, it will occur during consultation. So nothing currently in upperwind in terms of our prescription or our design would change. We may end up with a lesser impact call to critical habitat. I don't think, I'm trying to remember all the aspects. I don't think it will affect upperwind at all, but it certainly won't change the design. Good question.
Any other questions? Okay.
Okay, be sure and let me know creative ways to get your feedback on the upperwind EA.
Yeah, we'll do some brainstorming on that, Aaron, and we'll maybe we can rendezvous and figure it out, and some creative ideas. And maybe I'll actually reach out to Todd. Seems like he's got a host of tools in the toolbox. So, okay, folks, for the sake of time, I think we'll move on to our next agenda item, which is just our standard sort of SGPC monthly news and member catch up. So first off, obviously I'm back. I'm no longer in Ohio in my friend's room, hosting these meetings, stealing other people's Wi-Fi. So that's good. I'm able to be a little bit more productive out here again. So thanks for your patience on that. I want to briefly provide a quick update, or at least a transition into this for our ZOA subcommittee. We've been doing some good work there, and I want to hand the mic over to John Paul Anderson real quick to update the group on that front. John Paul, take it away if you're ready.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. So what we've been working on the ZOA for the early cereal habitat. We're going to be doing some sort of edits and revisions. Hopefully have those done by the end of February, and looking to present the draft to you guys as the whole group in March at our next meeting. And that's about it.
Short and sweet. Nothing wrong with that, John Paul. Yeah, that's basically what's been going on, folks. We've been meeting as a subcommittee, as you all know, over the last year or longer, year and a half or so, working on this particular issue. And the subcommittee has really come up with some good ideas, and we've been working to synthesize that in a formal ZOA document. So we've got that draft out to the subcommittee, getting some feedback there, and we'll get that back to you. Thanks for synthesizing the good work we've done thus far, John Paul.
Oh, anytime.
Yeah, and of course, if anyone has any questions or input in the meantime, feel free to reach out to me and I can connect you to the subcommittee as well. So let's see. Okay, some other items related
Tom,
to the.
Tom
Yeah,
had
go
a
ahead.
hand up, I believe.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry about that. I didn't see you there. Go for it.
Oh, this is not pertinent to that. It was just a general question. About 2 years ago now, I think, we had engaged with the PNW research folks on the economic impact of stewardship sales on Skamania County, and it was, I'm trying to remember the lady's name now.
Gene Daniels.
Dean Daniels and Mark Pincus, yeah.
Yep.
Have we had any feedback from them in terms of a final document?
Yeah, good. A very timely question. That's actually my next bullet point, Tom, is that Jean is going to present findings from that study at our next meeting. So she's going to provide a presentation that she and Max recently presented that information at the Pinchot Partners meeting, and Max is unfortunately unavailable for our March meeting, but Jean has offered to take the reins and present that and provide us with an update. So good question and a timely one.
All right, thank you.
Yep. So I alluded to our annual meeting there. So that planning is underway, folks. We're trying to shoot for a March date for our annual meeting. There's a steering committee conversation in the works to try to figure out some logistics associated with that. And, you know, when I mean logistics, some timing, content, speakers, those sorts of things. So if anyone has feedback about that in the meantime, of course, feel free to reach out with that. We are hoping to, you know, do standard annual meeting stuff at that meeting. We're considering maybe breaking it up over 2 days because, of course, we don't want to keep folks on Zoom for a super long meeting. We'll kind of lose our attention span and productivity. So working out those logistics, stay tuned on that, but we are targeting our March or April meeting. And I'll keep you in the loop on that when we do make those decisions. Another front is our sort of virtual field trip / story map. I'm back in the PNW, so I can get back out onto the forest and work on that. But hopefully, fingers crossed, by the end of this summer, we can actually have some in-person field trips again after a good chunk of folks have been vaccinated, and we've kind of figured out some strategies for handling that and the challenges that it offers. So stay tuned on those fronts as well. We've got some exciting stuff going on. That's all I've got in terms of our member / monthly news updates. The next meeting is March 18th. Again, we're likely going to target a sort of an annual meeting format for that. That's up in the air. Part of the stuff that will include would be like annual budget review, work plan review, sort of setting some bigger picture goals for the upcoming year, looking at sort of our subcommittees and the work that they're doing, as well as kind of getting some summaries about Forest Service planning and initiatives and how we can become involved in that. So some exciting things on the front here. So appreciate everyone's passion and dedication to all these initiatives and your willingness just to sit here for Zoom meeting after Zoom meeting. I know it's getting tough, but I think we're sticking with pretty high enrollment numbers here at these meetings. So I appreciate everyone's perseverance and willingness to spend some time online. That said, we're finished for the day, but I'd like to just kind of open it up to any kind of input, sort of informal banter, questions, comments, just general feedback about our speakers we've been getting lately, or any kind of directions that folks would like to see things head in the future relative to speakers. Does anyone have anything to say?
Where did you hear of our speaker today? How did that get lined up?
I was just doing some carbon sequestration research, you know, looking at peer-reviewed studies and that sort of a thing. And I came across Todd as well as Dr. Grant Ontl, who we had last month, you know, in the same sort of research. And it seems like they're doing a large bulk of that carbon work up at the Northern Research Institute. So it just so happened that they knew each other. You know, it's a small sort of field out there. They all knew Mark Harmon as well. So everybody seems to be, we're ticking the right boxes with who we're picking here. And we're lucky that these folks have been available to spend a couple hours with us each time. It's been great. Yeah, so we're always on the lookout for other guest speakers or even broader topic areas for future guest speakers. So that's the kind of feedback I'm always on the lookout for. Keep that in mind, folks. How's everybody been handling this ice storm? Is everybody staying safe? Everybody's had power for this whole time. I know Lucy didn't have power for a couple of days, right, Lucy?
Yeah, our ancient willow tree split in half in the ice storm and fell on our house. So that was unexpected, to say the least.
Yeah, for sure. That's a double whammy. You lose your tree as well.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, it sounds like the bad weather has moved down to Texas. There's folks down there are really struggling right now. Been without power for a few days. The shelves are empty. Plus you're in Texas, so you got that to deal with as well. Yeah. Does anyone have any other comments, questions? What have we been all up to in any snow sports enthusiasts out here? Am I the only one hitting the mountain, me and Jeremy?
We snowboarded our backyard down to the creek. That was pretty sweet.
Wow.
Kids are having a blast.
There you go.
Does running a snowblower count as a sport?
Say it again.
You said, does running a snowblower count as a sport?
Yeah, I think so. That might be more of that type 2 fun, but I think, anything outside counts as snow sports.
Our high school girls soccer team had their first game yesterday, so we're moving along.
Awesome. No, I'm sure they're stoked to get back out there. Yeah, I know Erin was telling me her daughter is really amped to be on the soccer team this year just to get out of the house, so I can understand it. Can't imagine being a kid with what's going on right now in the world. It's got to be a really challenging time. So looks like Ryan made a comment. He made half of an igloo with his daughter before it turned into slush. Half is better than none, I suppose.
Oh. Yeah.
Anybody have anything else to share with the group? Any feedback, any ideas for future guest speakers that's off the top of your head that I can kick around and look into? Or I guess topics is more of a realistic point of conversation at this point.
WDFW updates maybe on game species and disease and what's going on with wildlife.
Yeah. Yep. I'll look into that. That's a great suggestion. I think it might be appropriate for maybe an annual meeting item as well. Some of these sort of broader agency updates. So I'll reach out to some folks on that one.
I have he's called a conflict biologist, and he spoke at our local library about sort of how they decide when to intervene when wild species are, in the urban interface. It was really interesting.
Yeah. Oh, that sounds interesting. Yeah, if you wouldn't mind putting me in touch or shooting me a contact or something, I'd look into that as well. Okay, folks. It looks like we're losing a little bit of steam here. I think it's about time to wrap it up 5 minutes early. So really appreciate everyone sticking around and your good questions and good feedback today, and looking forward to getting together again next month. Thank you so much. Reach out about anything at all, as always. My pleasure.
Meeting. See you next month.
Bye-bye.
See ya.